Okay, so welcome to today's segment of live stream with the Third Testament Foundation. Today I'm going to read from the Third Testament, Volume 1. By the way, Happy New Year, and I hope you got through the holidays in one piece. And we just continue with where we started out with this weekly talks. And you're welcome to chat in with questions during the talk and or email before and after. So if there's some certain subject you want to talk about, we can take it up in the talk. So today, before we start reading, we need just a little bit of background. If we look at this symbol, where Martinez explains the triune principle of X1, X2, and X3, the unmanifest, nameless source, where we are one with God, and the X2, creative power, and X3, the creative world, or our creative bodies. And we have these rainbow colored bodies. We have 6: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and indigo. And those 6 bodies, he calls them the basic energy bodies. So we have the instinct body, red. We have orange, the gravity body, or what we know as the physical body. Then yellow is the feeling body. Green is symbolizes the intelligence body. Blue symbolizes the intuition body, and light indigo indicates or symbolizes, represents, depicts, the memory energy. So we have to remember that this is a symbol for the living being. It's not anatomically correct, but it's symbolically correct. So now we know that we have these 6 bodies. So in the text, Martinez talks about the physical body, the feeling body, and intelligence body in particular. So when he talks about that, we know that these are the bodies, right, that we have. That the orange is the physical body, and the others are the spiritual bodies, right? So the other 5 are spiritual bodies, and orange is the physical body. We also could learn a little bit about this one. If we see the physical body, when we have the physical body, it is here where the orange is culminating. That's where the killing principle or gravity energy is culminating. And when he talks about the embryonic state of the other bodies, that just means that these other bodies here, yellow, green, blue, and light indigo, they're not culminating. So that's what he doesn't do any more distinction than calling them the embryonic body, embryonic state in the text. So just remember that here in evolution, because our physical body is dominant or culminating, there's still the other bodies in relative strength. So that's they're still there in embryonic state. That's the term he uses in the text. So now let me just continue to the text and read the text. And it's section 223 till 232. And of course, this might take about half hour. And if you need to take a break in between, of course, just press the space bar and pause and whatever. So, but this is very interesting text because, and it's very pertinent to today, what's going on today. Because one thing is the wars, and the text explains why there's wars towards the end, and also the other thing is the scientific community and all these scientists. What is really science? What is a true scientist? And how can we know that certain researchers are biased or funded by industry to kind of verify their products to maximize their profits? So that he talks about what is a scientist. So, and it's a truth seeker. A researcher is really a truth seeker, and he goes into talking about how scientists, the area or the hypothesis, the theories that the scientist is making is for material science is within the area of the material world. But as evolution goes on, more and more this hypotheses and theories will go into the spiritual realm, where we cannot just measure the things that we're investigating and researching. So that puts a lot of demand on the scientist development of moral standard or moral code. So with that in mind, I was going to start the reading, and of course I'll take a little bit of breaks in here once in a while, because there's some part of the text is self-explanatory and other is a little harder to read. So let's start with the first section. We have now become acquainted with the fact that terrestrial mankind's so-called physical condition is actually not by any means purely physical, but consists of a combined mental and physical function, and that a purely physical existence is in reality only to be found in the very first stages of the animal kingdom, where the creatures can still experience life only in a form of undefined pleasant and unpleasant sensations, and yet this is also based to a certain extent on the spiritual energy, because the energies of instinct and feeling are spiritual energies. Nevertheless, terrestrial mankind's existence, being generally considered to be a physical one, is due to the fact that its day consciousness is still supported only by the physical body. In other words, the body of gravity, which in its connection with the embryonic body of feeling is only a basis for physical senses, to which the spiritual world is absolutely invisible. But as the spiritual function of consciousness in terrestrial mankind must still be considered as being in its first weak embryonic stage, in that spiritual bodies cannot yet support the consciousness, while its physical function of consciousness, on the contrary, is at its highest, the consciousness being supported by its physical body, then this physical existence drowns, so to speak, the weak spiritual one, and it is in relation to this condition of contrast that terrestrial mankind's spiritual experiences are met with or apprehended only as thoughts or thought pictures, while actually they are just as real as physical or material objects. So if you take a little break here, you see that this part here, I think, is interesting, because our day conscious awareness is on the physical body. All of this information we're getting through this physical body drowns all the information we're getting from the other 5 bodies, the spiritual bodies, right? So, and that's because the orange is commenting, right? That on the symbol. So, as evolution go forward, we will get the yellow to culminate, which means our day consciousness can be on the yellow feeling body, right? So that is why we now, when we look around, everything we talk about is all the physical area, because that's the only information we have. Until our spiritual bodies evolve enough and get strong enough to carry our consciousness, our day conscious awareness, until then we can only our consciousness can only be carried by the physical body, right? So if we continue here, but there are these thought pictures, right? So we're getting from the let me read this part again then. But drowns it. So, but these thoughts and thought pictures are just as real as physical objects or material objects. So that means the thoughts that we're having are actually just objects on a spiritual plane. If these spiritual objects are not apprehended by the individual as being just as realistic as physical ones, it is due to the fact that the spiritual bodies have still not reached such a culmination on the spiritual planes of existence as the physical body has reached on the physical plane. Therefore, his consciousness will necessarily be dominated by physical experiences, and as long as the spiritual bodies are still not able to support this consciousness, he will feel one with his physical body, thinking that all his functioning belongs there, while in actual fact all of his functions of consciousness consists of reactions between different basic cosmic energies released by different bodies. So that's the 5 other ones in the rainbow of the living being symbol that we went through in the beginning. So terrestrial man's most fundamental body is that which makes up his physical body. Through the brain and the nervous system, that body is bound up with the spiritual bodies which, for terrestrial man, emerge only in an embryonic condition, but through which mental functions are being released. So the spiritual bodies are still functioning, but not as strong as the physical body. I mean, that's why we can think and have feelings, right? That because we have these other spiritual bodies besides the physical. 222. As all as all mental functions are of an electric nature, they can only have physical release or reaction through a circuitry or antenna system. It is a system of this kind that the individual has in his brain and nerves. It consists of energies, partly physical and partly mental. Therefore, it can be tuned to different grades of exactitude and so be brought into contact with the equivalent degrees of physical or spiritual energies, that is to say, energy waves. This means that through the brain and nervous system, the individual is able to come into contact with the reaction of the interplay between his bodily structure and the basic energies. This reaction is the inevitable basis of manifestation or experience of life, and should thus be considered as a release of electric energy waves which pass through the brain and nervous system. As long as they pass through the physical side of that system, as long as they pass through the physical side of that system, they are identical with the individual sensations of the pleasant and the unpleasant. But terrestrial man cannot consciously follow his sensations or these electric waves further than into the brain and nervous system, because after they have passed through the physical side, they are of the spirit in pure essence, and thereafter can be experienced only by spiritual bodies, which are, at this stage, the physical body used to be when it had not yet developed physical senses such as sight and hearing. This is why the individual cannot experience the reactions or the electric waves as realistic physical feelings further than just into the physical part of the brain and nervous system. But beyond this physical part, the electric waves continue as non-physical and can be experienced by the individual only according to how far his spiritual bodies are developed in order to be able to react to these waves. However, the waves are not experienced through these bodies as physical sensations, but, on the contrary, as spiritual feelings, which is exactly the same as thoughts or thought climates. Thus, the brain and the nervous system constitute the individual's gateway to the spiritual world. I mean, this is kind of interesting to me. It's just like the highlight of this segment, because you have your brain and nervous system, and he's saying that it's both physical as well as non-physical. So it's both immaterial or spiritual, right? So in order to be a gateway or a portal, which is basically a door, you need to have on the one side and the other side of the door, right? So one side of the door is the physical, the other side of the door is spiritual. That's how a door works, right? It connects two rooms. So if you have this portal or gateway between the physical and the spiritual, that's how the information can travel between those two states. And that's what he's explaining to us here, that the brain and nervous system is a portal or a gateway. So it's both spiritual as well as physical. In as far as the rest of mankind's spiritual bodies are still undeveloped, he will remain a victim to the irrational belief that the gateway, the brain and nervous system, is the cause of his mental functions, and so he is still unaware of the spiritual bodies or the true facts of the matter. This irrational belief is stimulated further by the effect of the fact that the gateway to the spiritual world that in the gateway to the spiritual world there are found certain small openings for special kinds of electric waves, meaning that in the brain and nervous system there are special centers or complexes for the various mental functions. So there's basically different brain centers for speech and vision and so forth. The human being in question will suffer from an illusion in believing that these special centers or complexes are the actual cause of his functions, while the truth is that they are only specific organs for physically transmitting and receiving specific spiritual energy waves or vibrations. Just as an antenna is not the cause of the music or the lecture received through a radio set connected to it, but is merely a sender through which the electric form of the music or lecture can be received and brought further to other centers of the apparatus or device, and there be translated back into its original form. So the brain and nervous system are, in no way, the cause of whatever visible manifestation may occur, but are simply parts of a system for transmitting and receiving the reactions between the individual's bodily structure and the basic energies in the form of electric waves. So it's this door function, it's the connection between the outside world and the inside world with this portal thing. That's the function of it, right? In the same way, as the reception or transmission through a radio set is discordant if there is something wrong with any of its component parts, so the transmission of reaction through the brain and nervous system is also discordant if there's something the matter with the particular centers or complexes in that system. Such disharmony in the mind of the individual are generally known under such terms as insanity, mental handicap, or paralysis. So this is like a little bit same discussion that in some scientific circles about genetic phenomena and stuff like that. So Matthias says this in a little different way. So 225. The consciousness of the more advanced animal and the consciousness of the more advanced animal and the human being consists then of a nature part physical and part mental or part spiritual. As we have pointed out, the plant constitutes the, well, here be a little tricky because basically he talks about the plant, which he talked about earlier, and I haven't included this in the text. Basically the plant's physical body, the plant, while we're looking at trees and stuff, what we're seeing is the plant's night consciousness. And the plant has its day consciousness on the spiritual realm. So that's why it's not conscious of the physical realm, because it's subconscious. So that's what he's explaining here. So as we have pointed out, the plant constitutes the subconscious side of an instinct being, and through its subconscious abilities are developed, which should bring about day consciousness and thereby cause that being's entry into the animal kingdom. So she's talking about that the plant will get more and more day conscious of the physical world, and thereby it will become an animal and enter the animal kingdom. So we have like examples of that, like the Venus flytrap and things like that. Likewise, we have now pointed out that terrestrial mankind's thought process and spiritual bodies constitute his subconscious, and through the transformation of this into day consciousness, he will enter the real human kingdom. So this is the interesting part for us, because when we become day conscious aware of our feeling body, intelligence body, intuition body, memory body, and so forth, spiritual bodies, when we become day conscious awareness of those, the same way that we're day conscious aware of our physical body today, then we will enter the real human kingdom. This is interesting, yeah? If we have mentioned so many factors in the introduction, it is only to provide the reader or the seeker of truth with a yardstick with which to measure the scope or capacity of physical knowledge here on earth. For if he has no yardstick and does not realize when that knowledge constitutes genuine authority and when it does not, and does not know what capabilities the originators of that knowledge lack in grasping eternal realities or the eternal truth, then the seeker of truth easily becomes a victim of an irrational belief that realities lying outside the present-day scope of science or recognized knowledge are fantasy or illusion. And because of this belief, the individual is quite without spiritual standing and is unable to direct his course upwards towards life beyond the physical world. In order to make this important truth still more clear, and before we pass over to the text of the symbol, in order to present a concentrated survey of the present chapter, we will give a brief insight into the basis of the experience on which human science and knowledge rests. So this is the important part, right? This sentence here. For if he has no yardstick, so if he doesn't know how to measure what's going on, and does not realize when that knowledge constitutes genuine authority and when it does not, and does not know what capabilities the source of the knowledge lack in grasping eternal realities or eternal truth, then the seeker of truth or researcher of sciences, you, me, easily becomes a victim of irrational belief that realities lying outside the present-day scope of science or recognized knowledge or fantasy or illusion. So the point is, just because we cannot measure the realities that's beyond the material world, which means that borders the spiritual world, just because we can't measure that, just because we can't measure a thought or a feeling, doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Doesn't mean that it's fantasy or illusion, right? So 226. With reference to what has been described in the present chapter, the physical body functions are the physical bodily functions are able to give the individual no experience of knowledge, but only a feeling, meaning that form of consciousness which dominates the primary zones of the animal kingdom. Terrestrial mankind differs from the creatures in these zones in that it has the ability not only to experience feelings but also to experience knowledge. While the first form of consciousness is to be expressed as physical, the last, on the other hand, must be expressed as mental or spiritual. But as terrestrial people's spiritual bodies are only emergent in an embryonic state and thus are chiefly only subconscious, the knowledge they are able to acquire manifests itself likewise in an embryonic state. As terrestrial mankind's supporting body for day consciousness consists of the physical body and physical senses rooted therein, which all give sensory experience, that is to say, physical seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and sensory impressions in general, it is consequently these sensory experiences that become the basis of the first release in the individual of this dawning mental functioning and the creation of knowledge. So here we're basing our knowledge on whatever we can and see and measure and so forth with the physical body, right? This knowledge will thus be the same as the beginning of the unveiling of the physical or material world. Material world. But as the material world, according to cosmic analysis, constitutes only an embryonic zone of existence, then terrestrial mankind's knowledge or science, as already mentioned, constitutes merely the outermost periphery of the spiritual world. However, terrestrial mankind's science does not remain at a standstill, but is under constant development, and will at some time come to include not only the spiritual world's outermost periphery, but also its very center. In other words, all the other planes of existence. So this is where we're going with science. We're just in the little embryonic stage right now, but it's gonna develop into including all of reality, including the spiritual realms. So this is why some people call Martinez's work, the Third Testament, spiritual science. So section 227, as previously mentioned, science is developing more and more towards spirituality, which is clearly shown when we look at terrestrial man's own evolution from a primitive to a civilized being. We see how he is able to gradually to make use of finer and ever finer material forces. Through the power of wind, water, steam, he arrived at electricity. By the discovery of his power, by the discovery of this power, science entered spiritual realms for the first time in a realistic way, for, according to later analysis, electricity is the commencement of spiritual energy, although still belonging to the plane of existence of gravity energy. From this spiritual zone of gravity energy, terrestrial mankind discovered still finer powers. These powers are called rays or waves. But this spiritual or electric form of gravity energy advances still further to such degree of fineness that it acts directly on the brain. And it is there where the energy streams through the brain that those thought climates come about, which we mentioned before and which demonstrate the killing principle, the animal tendencies, and all that which we call evil. And that's because it's still the gravity energy that's used to think, right? We're thinking materialistically. But as this energy gradually merges more and more with basic energies from the next planes of existence, such as feeling and intelligence, it becomes increasingly inaccessible to purely physical senses. The researcher remedies this with the help of technical instruments such as microscopes and telescopes. But in the most elevated areas where present-day science is at work, these instruments for extending the senses have already begun to be inadequate, and the observations can no longer be pure sensory experiences but appear as calculations, which of course belong to mental functioning or spiritual sensing. Where through physical sensing the individual has support for all the details in these calculations, the results are the same as spiritual facts. Here on the edge of the area of physical sensing, the individual has more and more difficulty in finding physical support for all the details in the object of his investigation, for many of these details are inaccessible to physical senses. The individual must then, out of the details still accessible to his physical sensing, compensate by conjectured conjectured details because the details let me read that again. The individual must then, out of the details still accessible to his physical sensing, compensate by conjectured details for the details not physically visible. In such cases, the results of the calculations are not facts, but what we call theories. In this way, science moves smoothly away from presenting practical physical facts to being able to present only physical theories. But as it is due to their spiritual nature that some of the details begin to be inaccessible for physical sensing, meaning that they are a mixture of so much feeling energy and an intelligence energy that they far outweigh the strength of the researchers' weak spiritual bodies, then only when the latter are sufficiently developed will science once again be able to present facts. However, these facts will not be physical but spiritual. As the fundamental spiritual details mainly consist of the harmonized energies of feeling and intelligence, which means love energy, and in the same way, the physical details mainly consist of the harmonized energies of gravity and feeling, which gives physical energy, so the spiritual bodies have to be developed in such a way that they emerge in corresponding harmony. This means that just as the body of gravity and the body of feeling had to develop to a certain mutual harmony in order to give the individual the faculty of physical sensing, in the same way, the body of feeling and the body of intelligence also have to develop to a certain mutual harmony in order to give the individual the faculty of sensing love energy. This sensing being synonymous with perfect spiritual sensing. As terrestrial mankind's advanced scientific researcher finds himself so much on the borderline between the physical and the spiritual world, that the objects of his investigation are such that he can only partly express them in a purely physical way, indeed in many cases only with the help of instruments of observation, and therefore in areas where he is insensitive he has to compensate for the deficiency by assumption. This leads to the beginning of a confrontation for him with great moral demands on the development of his consciousness. He must possess a consciousness in which no violent frustration or mental disturbance takes place. He must be completely cleansed from all inferior desires, tendencies, and vices, for otherwise his faculty of concentration will be adversely interfered with and thereby ruin the chance of a perfect result in his investigations. And as he is here in advance of the ordinary masses in knowledge and research, his results in many cases cannot be checked by his fellow men. It is required of the researcher first and foremost that he has so strong a love of truth that in no case will he allow himself, for his own prestige, to be led into distorting his results with the help of small or large inaccuracies, and so lead people astray. It will be of no consequence how much a person has studied and how much examinations he has passed in that department of investigation and science which terrestrial mankind is now entering. The researcher will not in any way be able to reach prominence if he has not a quiet mind, that is to say, a consciousness in which there is found no tendencies whatsoever with regard, with regard to pursuit of fame, power, or riches, a consciousness in which all powers are united in a concentration on one thing only, truth. For, to the same degree as the researcher deviates from having these qualifications, so will the manifestation of honesty be an impossibility, and his results must be correspondingly not the truth, but falsehood, not knowledge, but ignorance. 229. So long as research still takes place in zones where the researcher can be supported by his physical senses, and if these are inadequate, can remedy the deficiency by the technical apparatus already mentioned, so that as far as they reach, he can obtain realistic physical experiences of facts to support his research, then he can very well be eminent and distinguished without a moral basis. In this case, there is not so much a demand made on his faculty of concentration in that he can actually hold the object being researched with the physical senses and with instruments or other aids, and the appropriation and utilization of these are not dependent on having any kind of moral basis. The immoral researcher will just as well be able to use a microscope or his own physical senses as a moral one. It is different when research is in zones where the physical senses and artificial aids cannot reach so far or be any support, and the observations are therefore based on the researcher's own individual mental faculty. Where this faculty does not reach, he cannot remedy it with any type of apparatus or helpful aids. Here, it will depend solely on the maturity of his spiritual bodies and thereby his faculty of concentration. As already mentioned, a perfect faculty of concentration depends upon absolute mental equilibrium, and this can exist only on the basis of complete cleansing of desires or lower tendencies in the consciousness. So here we return to the eternal saying, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." Terrestrial mankind's science is now nearing that zone of evolution where its representatives can be eminent only through morality. So science will now begin to pass on to the spiritual planes. In other words, the object of its research becomes thought or mental life. But a person can only be an authority in such research in relation to that area of thought, climates, and mental life which he himself has overcome and now controls. An individual who is still governed by lower tendencies can never be any kind of authority for someone who has long ago overcome them. As long as someone is an alcoholic, he cannot be an expert in rehabilitation. The zone into which science is now passing is a zone of love. So people who are not very far forward in the development of love cannot have any authority in that zone. However, much material knowledge they may possess. Naturally, material knowledge should not be despised. On the contrary, it is an immensely important factor without which spiritual science or the science of love would never be able to come to perfect fruition. It is precisely through material science that mankind has been led forward into the zone of love, and through that same science has developed the faculty of meeting a higher form of consciousness. It is no longer possible for anyone to continue with scientific research merely on the material plane. This does not mean that the material plane has a limit. On the contrary, the physical plane has no limit within its own province. It is just as limitless as other planes of existence in their own areas, meaning that they can continue throughout eternity to reveal new details precisely because they are under constant transformation. Millions of new details are created within less than a fraction of a second. So the researcher would never finish with physical investigation if something of quite a different kind did not appear. As we already know, material research exists on the basis of too much intelligence in relation to feeling, which means that it exists on the basis of the energies of gravity and intelligence linked with primitive feeling. So this indicates that material science exists on a basis of still unfinished and underdeveloped harmony in the consciousness of the individual. This consciousness will therefore manifest a corresponding disharmony which, among other things, is reflected in the idea that material science is cold, in other words, insensitive. On account of his primitive faculty of feeling, the individual cannot to any great degree sense or grasp the details in feeling energy and thus is incapable of acquiring knowledge about the details on the plane of feeling. Therefore, his knowledge becomes one-sided, materialistic, and insensitive. It is used in the service of the dark morality, the killing principle, for building tools for murder and mutilation, and in war for the seizure of power. Material science is thus largely an expression of animal consciousness at the level of genius. Not all animal tendencies reach their highest manifestations in those creatures we generally call animals, but in terrestrial mankind. However, that is quite natural. The first thing that had to happen in animal when it began to be receptive of higher mental energy, which in this case means intelligence energy, was of course that it had to use this higher energy for the satisfaction of its animal wishes and in the service of its animal consciousness. By the power of this higher mental energy, it quickly became superior to other animals who were not able to receive this energy. This superiority consists then of being able to practice a greater manifestation of animal tendencies or the principle of killing, and thus gives its source the title of human being. This source has received this title because its superiority is caused by intelligence energy, which is the same as human or higher spiritual energy. But although this creature is still far from being in harmony with the planes of existence where spiritual energies are found, it still constitutes the embryo of a real or true human being, and here we recognize a stage of beings to which the rest of mankind belongs. But in order that the animal can become a real human being, the animal tendencies have to be brought up to their peak, up to the level of genius, and must be completely lived through. Only after this culmination can the transformation and recreation from animal to a real human being be accelerated. It is through much suffering and continual killing, war and mutilation, through the great exploitation of other living beings, and the strongly egoistic way of life which terrestrial mankind, due to its sense of mastery, manifests towards both fellow beings of its own kind and towards ordinary animals, that the seed is sown from which, according to the eternal cosmic laws we will learn about later in Livets Bog, mankind will irrefutably come to reap the fruit. As this fruit is of the same nature as a seed, meaning sorrow and suffering, the individual will inevitably, sooner or later, either in the present life or in coming lives, be involved in and conditioned by this self-sown state of suffering. But as pain and suffering to a certain degree develop and ennoble the faculty of feeling, by this means the individual becomes receptive and sensitive to feeling energy. But as feeling energy, when it is in harmony with intelligence energy, becomes genuine love, and love again is the same as manifesting unselfishness and warmth of the spirit, the human being gradually, as the faculty of love develops, begins to sow another seed, the fruit of which he will later just as inevitably come to harvest. This fruit is not by any means pain and suffering, but constitutes the real human abilities and tendencies which lead the individual towards the great birth, and which will enfold him in a transfigured existence. With this development of love, all animal skills and faculties will degenerate, and in this way mankind will become less qualified as an animal and more qualified as a human being. And it is the different grades in this transformation which represent the different steps of character shown by terrestrial mankind. But at the same time as the individual develops his faculty of feeling and becomes sensitive to feeling energy, through this he begins to have a new form of experience, meaning an experience which an individual poor in feeling is unable to have. When this knowledge of feeling is in harmony with that individual's knowledge of intelligence, then, as we mentioned, there arises knowledge of love, which is the same as wisdom. Simultaneously, while he is in that condition of consciousness, the faculty of intuition or cosmic consciousness is developing in him. In other words, terrestrial mankind's science will be transformed into the science of love in the same degree as the standard of feeling of its source becomes refined and approaches the real human kingdom. But to the same degree, as science approaches that kingdom, it begins to reach beyond the physical plane, and to the same degree as it reaches beyond material things, it becomes more and more inaccessible for those who have not yet developed the faculty of feeling, in other words, love. It becomes more and more difficult to prove facts and experiences to people who still only sense on the material plane. Indeed, even in those cases where they are presenting themselves as scientists of an ordinary present-day standard. Thus, we see that in no way whatsoever can we avoid a refinement of consciousness or mental life in order to attain higher knowledge and wisdom. And without higher knowledge and wisdom, there's no admittance to the eternal truth or to the all-penetrating sight of God. So, with those words, I think we call it a day, because I just thought that it's very pertinent today to really know what's going on in the scientific community with all this bias studies and industry funded studies and things like that. So it's important to know that it can't be any different right now, because the sciences have not evolved their morality enough. The moral code is not up to snuff yet to be real scientists or seekers of truth. So thank you for listening, and I hope to see you soon. And you're always welcome to email questions with subjects we can take up on the live stream. And we're going to have a live stream next week, Saturday, and then we're taking a break uh, for a week. So there's going to be a little longer between the next one. But next Saturday we're on, and thank you for today, and hope to see you soon.